Hello. Welcome to WordPress Accessibility Day. My name is Danielle, and I'm the founder of Overnight Website and Kinetic Iris Web Development Studio. Thank you for joining us for developing accessibility first WordPress themes with Nicole Garcia and Annie Heckel. A little bit about them. Nicole works with local educators and community partners to teach technology to students and those who are new to the industry. And Annie is a web accessibility specialist and educator currently working to ensure that Cornell University's web properties have as few accessibility barriers as possible. Please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A tab next to the video, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. You can also use the ideas section to chat with other attendees.
Hi. Is this live now? Okay. Hi. Sorry. I'm going to move through my slides here. First of all, I'm Nicole, and this is Annie, as we were introduced. So when I told Annie that I wanted to do a talk about making accessibility first themes, she was a little surprised. She was from the Ally community already, and everything is accessibility first for her. And I said, this is not this way in development, where accessibility is kind of added on after launch or in the form of a checklist or like the request of a client, if it's added on at all. Usually developers have no workflow to allow the space for accessibility or the process to architect or test it. And so hopefully this talk will help everyone gain a new insight on how we can make this work for agencies and teams. I also kind of wanted to show the audience that accessibility auditors and the developers who have to perform the code editing aren't really against each other. In our former jobs, I even survived an audit done by Annie's company, and we're still friends. So that is a possible thing. So accessibility first. What do we mean when we say accessibility first in the context of this talk? So I'm looking for an architecture that provides the best user experience for all users. The architecture puts accessibility before coding and design is done to save money and time, as the components won't need to be recoded or redesigned after they're already created in a non-accessible way. So putting that effort into the architecture guides the overall development process with all the stakeholders, from content and marketing to design and development.
All right, so there we go. So Nicole's going to go over a number of different possible approaches as we get into the presentation here. But no matter which of the following approaches you use, keeping these basic elements of accessibility in the forefront as you create your theme will help you to make good decisions. Following the principles of perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, these main guiding concepts for WCAG version 2, as everybody who knows WCAG will know. And then falling back on WCAG can make it a lot easier to ensure that you're at the very least meeting the accessibility baseline. Then build for the end user's needs and not for the needs of developers and designers. If you think about end user needs, you're more likely to shift away from the minimum accessibility and get into actual usability, just going beyond that baseline that we get when we adhere to WCAG. And then, of course, as always, semantic HTML is always the big thing. So whenever you can use it, whenever you can build it in, always do, since it usually has the accessibility support built right in. So that said, do keep in mind you can't cover all the bases. There are going to be some things where designers and content creators have to step up and take responsibility. This was a lesson I learned in my previous life as a college professor. I could never anticipate all of my students' mistakes, so I just had to be able to kind of roll with it and deal with whatever they threw at me. So of course you won't be able to stop the users of your theme from making some bad choices in terms of design or content entry, things like poor color contrasts, misusing the heading tags. But if your theme's basic framework is built for accessibility, that'll make the end user experience better pretty much by default. All right, back over to Nicole.
Okay, which brings us to, speaking of designing for users and not the people who have to use the site, or the people who own the site, WordPress site builders. So a lot of times when we talk about building themes, we talk about how they're going to be assembled, and site builders is one of the ways in which many people choose to build a WordPress site. They're very popular. A lot of clients ask for them, but they come with a lot of accessibility problems. Like Annie was saying, if you kind of give anybody the ability to just style things at will, some really bad things can happen. For example, this might be some of the code that you generate the site builder. The content, the editor for the content can come along and they can add things. And these two things could look the same on the front end to the person editing the stuff. But for a accessibility, view, these are very, very, very different things. Obviously, they don't have the semantic, tags to them. They can have very different meanings when you look at them with different devices, and that's where we're trying to move away from this style of development. So for avoiding the site builders, what should we use instead? For the best accessibility and a truly built-in process, and I'm going to go back through this several times about having a built-in process, because the more you can have a built-in process, the less you have wiggle room for accessibility to go very wrong. So for a built-in process, you're probably going to need to go the development route. And we're going to go through a few paths today to try to figure out what that looks like to make a truly accessible development process. So one of the options is headless. Headless sites separate the WordPress content management from the front-end delivery. So you have your content being served by the normal WordPress content manager, and then you pull it out via REST or GraphQL. So most of the front ends for headless are now JavaScript apps or static HTML sites, which are lightning fast. But the biggest argument for that is that if it's for accessibility, as you can give your users options on what front end they would want to see, or you can change the default based on what device or browser the user has. While headless is the most development intensive, I do believe it can be streamlined into being much easier. There are many hosting services that make headless deployments easier, like WP Engine has a service called Atlas. With headless, you can also separate design from content and limit the content into ways that make accessibility supports easier, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Most of the headless sites now use React or Vue in the front end, although I've recently been enjoying doing some Gatsby static sites. So that's another option too. So custom themes. When it comes to custom themes and accessibility, what you want to do is not recreate the wheel every time. If you start with an existing theme and have to add on all your supports in a piecemeal way, like add a plugin here, plugin there, change a few things are bound to get left out, and the process takes a really long time. And then companies start to complain about the development cycle being too long, about things going wrong. That's when it really goes wrong. So if you aim for a build process, instead of building a theme by hand, you can add in the accessibility supports without having to create them from scratch. You then replicate your base each time and then add your final touches with styles and components to create a unique site. Much like this GIF of building the car, you take this blueprint, right, that builds your base car, And then you get to add the paint and trim to make each car unique. In the resources in the end, I've added some links to a few theme frameworks you can use to get started with this route on the in the repo. If you start with a base that has a built-in process like WP Rig or Sage, you can add your components to that and keep building new themes on top of it. Each site looking unique, but sticking with the same base accessibility components that you have set forth. Sorry, I'm struggling with my braces and they stick to my lips every once in a while. So that framework flow, right? So how do we put this together and make it easier for an agency to have the custom building process while also adding in accessibility? So your first step is to identify the common elements used in multiple sites and put them together in one place. So this could be headers or menus or footers, call out boxes, forms, and so on. It's important to lay down the scaffolding for accessibility and styling, but not to assign specific styles to your base. Like you're going to add the specific styles later for the individual theme. You just want to kind of create your base that has all of your components that you want. The idea here is that accessibility supports are built into the process and the framework. They won't get left out. Making them default makes them included in the end. You can also include the list of plugins you're going to label as must use, such as advanced custom fields, which we'll talk about in a little bit if you want to use that, or say you want to require Yoast to make an automated sitemap to add new pages to, because that's very good for accessibility. Okay, so this is what it might look like. So on the top here, you have your base theme building materials, your components, your supports, your must-use plugins, and your base styles. And that is your base repository that you're going to start all of your themes from. And then on the bottom, you're going to add in per site, so you have your custom styles and your images. That's going to be on a per project basis. You then combine them into a build process to make each individual theme. This process is nearly the same for headless and for custom themed sites. So for headless, you might have two build processes outlined. You might have one for the actual theme, and then there might be one for the front end. And then for the custom theme, you might just have one build process for the theme. And then you might need a document that outlines the setup of your site and any plugins. So limiting content. And this is the part where we get in a little bit of trouble with the other departments in an agency. Why would we want to do that? And what does that mean? So when we were talking about the site builders, we're talking about how users can do some crazy things. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to guide and shape and give them some rules about what they can and can't put into the pages. So we're limiting the number of inputs that they can be added to the editing screens. They can't free build the thing and then hurt accessibility. All of the code or all the content would be pulled into a code layer. So it's separating the code and the content. We can also use this to add functionality automatically to the content, such as adding read more links to the headings, because we had the content providers just add in the words and not make links themselves. We're going to do two examples of this. One is a Gutenberg example for the Gutenberg builder in WordPress, and the other one is with ACF or Advanced Custom Fields. Okay, so if I wanted someone to make an alert box in the content, I could tell them to do a standard code block and put some code in an editor like this. It might get the job done, but it's also not very standardized and it allows for a lot of error. So if I want to add in, other sort of supports into this, I can't do that because, we have these code blocks and they're set into the content. So alternatively, if I could make a custom Gutenberg block. So this is when they're doing the page editing, and they would add this block, and their only options are to choose what kind of alert they want and to put the text in there. They don't have the option of just free coding it. They don't have the option of, reinventing their own wheels here. They can only do this. This helps for two things. One is that, like I said, they don't have the option of just making it up there. And two, say if the standards change later, the accessibility standards change later, I can just change the block in one place and make this thing appear differently later. And I don't have to go through every post and find every block that we use that way. We're not going to specifically discuss how to make the blocks in this talk, but I did post some of the resources to the repo for this talk if you are interested in learning how to do those. So here's our other example. It's advanced custom fields. This is nice because it's a much more user-friendly sort of thing. Like you can use, you don't have to have people with coding knowledge who can go in there and be able to add the fields. So here, say we have a post, and at the bottom of the post, we have these special fields for our run details, and we have a purpose and a distance, and it limits how people can enter text in here because they don't have to remember to add the distance. They don't have to remember purpose, but it also pulls their content in a way that if I wanted to link the distance to, a chart or something, I can do that. I can also add any sort of supports I need to the content that gets pulled out in that way. It separates the content from the presentation, basically. ACF also makes blocks now. With the latest Pro edition of ACF, you can make these custom blocks that you can use with a WordPress post or the site editor, full site editing. And so here, the developer has defined a quote block that someone who is using this quote block can only make the quote text and the author and the title and then add an image. They can't do anything else with the block. So this block can have supports built in to the front end to display in a proper way based on user preference. If the user wants dark text, light text, larger text, they can do all of that because it's not locked in to the content. The nice thing about the ACF and the ACF blocks, sorry, brace is sticking, are that they allow you to export the fields and the other structures that you create. So they can be used on multiple sites without someone having to manually enter the stuff on all the sites. So it's part of the build process to include these fields and blocks in your theme and not a manual off one thing that makes it easier for you to not leave anything out.
So just some general tips to kind of start wrapping up. One that I kind of had to get in as the accessibility person is a warning about ARIA, because one of probably the most common things I see causing a big failure when someone's been trying to make something accessible is that they heard about ARIA somewhere, somehow, and somebody told them that ARIA can make it all better. It can make it communicate with the screen reader and it'll be all great. And so people will just kind of take ARIA and sort of sprinkle it in like some kind of magic accessibility dust, which it is not. ARIA is awesome. But the first rule of ARIA is essentially don't use ARIA. More realistically, it's don't use ARIA for something where you can actually use HTML instead. If you've got semantic HTML that will do whatever it is you're trying to do with ARIA, always use the HTML, not the ARIA. If for some reason you can't use the semantic HTML to do whatever it is you need to do, that's when you start to bring in ARIA. But if you bring in ARIA, make sure that you know how to use it. It's very exacting. It's got its own specification. So if you want to use ARIA, you've got to make sure you go learn the ARIA specification, figure out what the relationships are, what different ARIA roles can be used on, and what different ARIA states and properties, like, can you use it on this component or not? Can you use it on this HTML element or not? Because there's a lot of rules, and ARIA states and properties are not all global. Some of them are very, very limited and can only be applied to certain things. So with that, no ARIA is better than using ARIA badly, because I don't think I've yet seen anybody really mess things up by inappropriately applying ARIA, but you can make things confusing. A good kind of, for instance, on this is that the ARIA label is one of the things that probably pops up the most often. It's an attribute that you can use to add an accessible name, an invisible and accessible name that you won't see on the screen, but that'll get picked up by assistive tech. The thing that people don't always realize about ARIA labels, aside from the fact that you can only use it on interactive, like user interface components, is that if you put an ARIA label on a component and you already had a visible label for that component, like say a link, if you had a link that was actually around some actual text, and then you put an ARIA label on the link, the ARIA label is going to take the place of the link text that was visible. And if you have something different in the ARIA label than you had in the visible text, that can get really, really weird for sighted users who happen to also use a screen reader for whatever problem. So no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So if you're going to use ARIA, make sure you know how you use it. Go look up the specification and be careful. The other general tip is that less is more. Don't try to do too much with any one component. And the good example here is don't have your main navigation add, every single page that you come up with. Because if you have a really gigantic main navigation, I mean, we all know how mega menus feel when you try to get into them and you can't find that one thing that you want. Imagine having that happen if you can only hear the page coming through. And so instead of seeing the giant mess of text, instead you're just hearing more and more and more choices. So you wouldn't want to have a main menu that has all the things in it. But you do need to satisfy multiple ways. So instead, you do something like what Nicole mentioned earlier, having a sitemap that automatically creates links to new pages as you add them. That way, you've got all of the content and all of the links there for multiple ways fulfillment. But it's not always front and center where it's going to hit your user, the end users, with cognitive overload every single time. So make sure you're careful how you're using components. Don't overload any single component, and just kind of consider carefully how it might come across to end users before you do too much.
Okay, so sometimes I get some pushback from clients, like they want a specific thing that is not good for accessibility, or they're asking me to do something that may not be the best idea. I do recognize that in the end, they are the customer, and I can provide them with the strong arguments, but I can't always win those. but I can move into the compromise phase. Like, how can I get the end result that I want while letting the client have what they want? Like, say they want a site builder, can you build training or documentation materials into your handoff process to get them some best practices? If they want functionality that is not friendly to all, can you build alternatives into your scope and pricing structure so that you are giving a complete package whether or not they asked for it? If you can talk them into certain functionality by pointing out facts of the potential problems created by ignoring accessibility, or show them additional benefits, maybe. Like, for example, this piece helps both accessibility and mobile users navigate your site, which represents whatever percentage of your traffic. That might be a good convincing argument for them.
Yeah, I always like to also, so we've got the carrots, the like, maybe this will bring more traffic, you know, this could be really good in this way, and this way. This sometimes we do also have to hit with a stick a bit. And I like to, one of the ones I like to start with is kind of guilt. And that's if they're being really resistant to something that's a particularly important accessibility support, like if they really want to use this one component that they have found somewhere from another vendor and they're like, this is so cool, but it's say not keyboard accessible. And they keep at it. You start by asking them, okay, so what users are you comfortable excluding here? Are there people that you don't want to be able to use your site? And getting into that, it's kind of an empathy exercise, but also just kind of making them understand how people are going to want to use the site, need to use the site. You know, you don't want to exclude users. And usually if you ask a client, okay, who are you comfortable blocking off from your site so that they can't be here, they can't use it, they can't look at your product, they can't look at your content, often they'll kind of startle and go, wait, I don't want to block anybody, because why would you want to block anybody? And having them start to understand, you know, how many people actually do have disabilities. At any one given time, it's something like 26% of the US population has a disability, whether it's permanent or temporary or situational. And if you can make them understand that having accessibility barriers means that actual real people who are just trying to do whatever it is that's being offered on the site, trying to access this service, trying to access this product, trying to access this content, they just want to be able to do the same thing. If you can get your clients to understand that they are putting a barrier in the way of somebody, that can often help a lot, because nobody really wants to cut anybody out that way. There is also, of course, the final big stick of, well, you know, somebody might get mad and sue you, but apparently from the studies that have been done recently, that doesn't have nearly as much of a positive effect as just reminding them that, yeah, people want to use your site and they won't be able to if you do this thing. So reminding them of the real people, the real end users who are going to want to use their site and who can be blocked from using it is really always a great approach to use, because, I mean, accessibility support isn't special. It shouldn't be seen as something special, because the people who need the accessibility supports are just trying to live their lives and do the same things as everybody else.
Yeah, I also get, I do get a little pushback sometimes from designers, because as a developer, I want to make things that are, you know, flexible and responsive. So if someone wants to put in their own user style sheet and they want to adjust the fonts on there and they want to change them and they want to change colors, and like, I'm totally okay all of that, but you know, this is their artwork. But it's also a consumable, you know, art that is dictated by company policies. So if you work together as a company to build in the requirements, like favoring these flexible responsive designs over pixel perfect, or you build in certain requirements about buttons or spacing or menus or things like that, you can serve everyone on every device better. So if everyone can learn to, like, as a company, like I said, just make a compromise, then they can kind of work together and get some of the stuff done. So I did put up a resource list and code snippets in the in a GitHub repo. So if anyone wants to go look at those things, we'll sure have the link available for you too. Thanks. And those are our contact information if you want to find us. I do apologize if anything that I was saying is not very clear, because still struggling with the braces. So if there was anything not clear, please feel free to find me later and ask me.
Okay, looks like we do have Q&A.
All right. So I just want to take a second to thank you both so much for your presentation. As a reminder, you can enter your questions in the Slido Q&A tab. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one, we'll get your perspective on and see if you know anything about. The question is, how do you handle sitemaps for very large websites? Sometimes I've seen sitemaps that are just giant alphabetical or date ordered lists. So how do you guys handle those?
Okay, Nicole, did you have anything? Because I've got one I could probably pop a good example.
Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that we worked on recently at Cornell is the university newspaper. And as you can guess, there's like tons of articles all the time. And so we don't have a sitemap that has every single article. So instead, what the sitemap does is it organizes things by category. And the sitemap, there are certain tags that articles will have, and each article, every single article that gets put up will have one or more tags on it. And so the sitemap does tags. It has those tags that are used to categorize the articles. And if you click on one of those tags, it'll take you to a list of all of the articles that have that tag. And so when you have that, you combine it with a site search, and that gives you the way to satisfy the multiple ways requirement without, again, like serious cognitive overload, because you're smacking your end users with like everything all at once. Because yeah, giant alphabetical date ordered lists are, wow. I mean, they're technically accessible. I don't think, WCAG doesn't have anything that says they're a failure. They're just cognitive overload.
Yeah. Do you have a user style sheet kind of thing, and then an XML version for search engines, or do you just use the one and it just links the categories?
I am not sure. I would have to go ask our design team.
I'm always curious about how people handle their sitemaps as well.
Yeah, I've gotten too far out of the like actual day-to-day work. So like I know that they have the things that they've built to do this and do it right and do it accessibly, but I don't know exactly how they work.
Yeah.
I would definitely say that kind of stuff begins with a content strategy, because if your sitemaps are just a bunch of giant stuff dumped there, you probably haven't thought out your content strategy very well to categorize and tag and whatever else those things. So there's probably better ways of breaking up content, and that's not even an accessibility thing. It's kind of like in every problem, because if you haven't broken your content into ways that it's easy for people to digest, then you probably have a bigger problem with the thing. So
right. Totally. So that definitely makes some sense. So the next question here that we have, when you're building from an accessibility first perspective, are there certain themes or plugins that are part of your default starter theme? Or do you just build everything from scratch?
No. I definitely, most recently, I was building out the two different things I built out recently. One was using WP Rig, which is it's you start with your base thing, and then you can add in all your accessibility for your menus and footers and add functions in it, and then it just becomes a build process. So, like, say I have the rig set up and it's customized for whatever the company is doing with it, and then I can add in specific things that one site needs, run the build, and makes the theme. And then I can switch out those components for a different site, like add in new components, run the build, it makes the theme. And so it's kind of like a little factory blueprint that way. The other thing that I've been doing a lot of stuff with lately is Gatsby, and Gatsby has a lot of accessibility supports built in. So you make your WordPress site, you make your little Gatsby site, it pulls it all out and makes into a static site, but it has all these little supports built in, so you can make the process, and then you can keep on replicating that process for new sites.
Cool. Makes sense. To double back real quick on sitemaps, we got another question in for that. They are often in the footer of a website. Should it be visually located somewhere else, or does it make sense that it's always in the footer?
I would not put an entire sitemap in the footer. It's like you wouldn't want to have the entire sitemap in the main nav. Anything that somebody's going to have to go all the way through to get to other stuff, and footers count for this because there's often stuff at the very end of the page that people want to get to, like terms, privacy, things like that. And I mean, if you don't have a giant site, sure, you could have all the page links there. But if you've got a big site, you'll want to have the sitemap be a separate page, and you can link to that from the footer, that's completely
right. But would you put it somewhere else too? I think I would actually put, if I was trying to do something for to make it most accessible, especially if I had like a mobile menu situation where you could just drop down the thing, I'd probably put it at the end of the menu too, so that you could hit it from the top and the bottom. It's not like in the way of anything, but it's nice if I'm like, I don't really want to make someone have to go through an entire page to find the sitemap, and I don't want to have to make them like click through 75 things to find the sitemap. So, making it from the drop-down menu or from the footer is fine.
Again, multiple ways requirements, really nice. You put it in the main menu and then in the footer too, at different spots you can get to it from.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's hard because you don't want to break patterns too much because people come to expect certain things, but then there are pattern breakers and rule breakers, and that tends to set up new trends. So maybe we're developing a whole new trend here by putting sitemaps into the mobile menus in the header. I like it. So if we move on to when you were talking about designers seeing their work as art, what are your strategies for working with them who see it as art rather than a way of sharing information? Do you have specific scripts that you fall back on, or other strategies that you use?
I mean, that really needs to be a company decision. Like, it can't come from the developers because no one's close to the developers anyways. But that needs to be a top-down decision. Like, if we've put people first, then we need to put people first as a company decision kind of thing. And then that would trickle down to everybody of how they see things. I think a lot of companies that will invest in UX designers will tend to have more interest in how people are experiencing the site. So looking for people that are companies that are doing user experience more than, we make pretty stuff, is definitely important. But I definitely think that, like I said, no one is listening to the developer, so it needs to be like a top-down thing, from the product managers or from the down from the CEO. Like, it just has to go all the way down from the top and be a company decision.
So it's also a place where the very mean accessibility people can come in. I mean, if we have to use the stick of like, no, you're not allowed to do this because accessibility, like, it'll sometimes raise some hackles, but it can get through. But I mean, the like, who are you willing to exclude approach can also work there. It's like, okay, this is your art, but are you really wanting to put a barrier in that will keep some people from being able to use this? Like, if you've got this really like complex line design that's got some neat depth perception stuff, are you really okay with the fact that some people will look at this and get dizzy and not be able to go further into the site? There's also the design challenge. Like, are you, the kind of designer who can't rise to the design challenge of making an attractive but accessible design? And that's, I think we can use the same stick on developers too. This is a challenge for you. And if you're a good designer and a good developer, you should be able to make this work. Because I know you can do this.
I love
I like
that
that.
approach.
You get your pride a little bit going there, and that can work in your favor a bit.
Challenging their intellect.
Yep.
And they'll prove you wrong. I love it. It feels a lot to me. So this is another question that came in. It feels a lot to me that custom blocks are really the future for making components the most user-friendly and accessible. Has your experience at Cornell found this? And I would add on to that the idea that they literally just launched the block locking features and things like that. So does that make you skew towards custom blocks, or do you still stick with ACF? How do you approach that?
I would say that the block stuff in WordPress 6.1 is kind of going to be huge. It's both, as a developer, it's both like fascinating and it's also scary, because it's like, oh, you can now full site editor. I'm like, oh no. Look what they're doing now. I definitely think that I don't think ACF is against the blocks. I actually think it would work with it, and I think they're about to update all their stuff to work with WordPress 6.1 too. I've been using the nightly build or whatever of WordPress for a little while to play with it, and it's working really great. So I don't think it's against it, but I definitely think that we're going to see, I think that WordPress is starting to learn from the rest of the development community, and they're starting to learn components and things like that other languages have been doing for a while. So definitely it's going to be what we're going to be doing. I do think that ACF or a tool like that makes it a little bit easier for the rest of the team, because they can just build stuff out the way they want it, and then the developer can just export the JSON file, and then they can put it into, that just makes it easier, rather than making it like, okay, you got to give me a list of the things that you want on the content page.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes those processes easier. So for a workflow thing, it might be easier, but definitely everything's going to be about blocks and how to make custom blocks and how to just make that easier. I'm still trying to work out how it's going to work with the full site editor. That's going to be a little bit scary and weird.
Yeah.
We'll
So
see.
it sounds like the answer is it depends on the requirements of the project, as always.
Yeah. No, they are. It is simply, it's going to go much. Like if you're not already doing custom blocks, it's going to be the thing that everybody's going to be doing now. Like they're just going to be selling custom blocks, as a service kind of thing. So
Yeah, I know
what everyone's going to be doing.
Our custom development team at Cornell we do custom components and have like a demo site where it's like, you can have this and you can have this. And so they've got things that our clients can go look at, and they can make a choice about what it is they want to include on their site. And we'll do, minimal modifications because they've already made them accessible. So it helps a lot, at least for the parts of the university that come to us for their sites, which is not everybody. Universities being decentralized as they are.
Well, speaking of that, we have one last question. How does Cornell handle enforcing accessibility standards? Is there a review team before a new website can go live? How does that work?
That is difficult. So universities are really decentralized. This is probably one of the most challenging parts of my position, because I'm basically the top dedicated web accessibility person at Cornell. And so I'm the person everybody's supposed to come to for web accessibility information and things, but I don't have a lot of enforcement mechanisms. We have a policy, an official policy that says everything is supposed to meet WCAG 2.1 level AA as a baseline. But they don't have to go through the custom development team that I'm housed under in our central IT. They don't have to use us to build their websites. They can hire an outside vendor to build a website. So because we have literally like thousands of websites at the university, thousands of different properties, we have some core university websites that get checked on a regular basis, anywhere from like once a year to once to every 18 months or so. That my team does an accessibility review of those sites as often as we can manage it. If a site's not covered under that set of core university sites, it is the responsibility of the unit that owns the site, like the particular college that owns the site. It's their responsibility to make sure that it stays up to date, stays accessible, doesn't have problems. So ideally, yes, there is a review before it goes live, and that's one of the services that we try to make sure everybody at the university is aware of. But realistically, it doesn't always happen because there is just so much activity going on. So it's hard. That and vended products is my other bugbear. Because I deal with a lot of vended products. But yeah, so we try to make sure that everybody gets some kind of accessibility review. Everybody is responsible for keeping them up to date and at least at WCAG baseline. But when there's so much of it, it's really, really hard to get.
Do you have any like resources that you give to people in regards to that, where if they say, hey, you're going with someone else, make sure they do this to at least make it easier?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a university-wide Site Improve subscription so that they can do at least the basic automated checks, because Site Improve does a pretty good job of catching what you can catch with automated stuff. We have a WCAG checklist that we developed for the accessibility team's use, but that we make available to the rest of the university, along with an explanation of how to test everything. So there's that. And then trainings, offering trainings every single month on doing how to do testing, basically automated tools, manual testing. And I get, at least a half dozen people in each of those every month. So they're interested. Everybody wants to do it and they're taking advantage of the resources.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it's making everybody's responsibility and then make sure they can get the information they need to do it is really the way to go. So.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's awesome and super helpful perspectives on small and large teams and all of that. So I just want to say thank you again, both of you, for having an extra long Q&A so that we can ask you some of these very important questions. So thank you for attending this session with Nicole Garcia and Annie Heckel, and you can continue the conversation in the chat or on social media using hashtag WPA11YDay and hashtag WP2022. We also appreciate it if you go to wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers on their presentation, and stay tuned for our next topic, which is accessibility is a partnership that requires communication. It's coming up next with Maxwell Ivy at 1 a.m. UTC, 8 p.m. Central. And while you're waiting, don't forget to visit our sponsors pages to grab virtual swag and enter for a chance to win great prizes. See you here right after the break.